Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Tara Mitchell, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation and Sisters in Crime Australia, I'd like to welcome you to our author event this evening, Wayward Women in Herstorical Crime. Now, this is the first of what is hopefully going to be many wine and crime events, and the library is absolutely thrilled to be partnering in this inaugural event with Sisters in Crime Australia, a group that was formed in 1991 to share a collective passion for women's crime writing, of which I'm very proud to be a national convener. The Geelong Regional Library Corporation and Sisters in Crime acknowledge the Wayward and Eastern Maar original owners of the lands on which the library services operate. We pay our respects to the Wayward and Eastern Maar elders, past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and celebrate the First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. Now tonight it looks like we have over 100 people joining us tonight, which is absolutely fantastic, and we're thrilled that you could all join us. So I'll start with some light housekeeping before we begin. The author panel will be running for around about 35 minutes, and we've got plenty of time for audience questions, so I'd encourage you to start thinking now about what you'd like to ask our wonderful authors. So you can participate in the live webinar at any time, and you can pop your comments and questions in the Q&A button and then type the question in. If you are joining us via an iPad or an iPhone this evening, you may need to touch your screen for the Q&A or the chat function to pop up and be visible for you. And also, if you'd like to watch this session again or recommend it to family and friends for them to watch, it will be up on the library's website from tomorrow. So, without further ado, grab a glass of whatever takes your fancy. I'm very happy with my red wine from Taylor's here. And let's get into this fantastic wine and true crime event, Wayward Women and Herstorical Crime. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Loretta Smith. Loretta, if you could give us a little wave so the audience knows which one you are. There you are, looking very cosy there in Melbourne tonight. Now, Loretta is a born and bred Melburnian, a writer of true stories, a committed feminist, and a political stirrer. True crime podcasts and books of all stripes are always threatening to keep her awake at night. Her other hobbies include saving the planet and making up songs in the piano. Loretta's historical biography, A Spanner in the Works, the extraordinary story of Alice Anderson and Australia's only all-girl garage, was published in 2019 by Hachette and is long-listed for the Sisters in Crime David Awards this year. Next we have Tanya Bretheron. Tanya, if you could give us a wave. Tanya's joining us all the way from Sydney via the magic of Zoom tonight. Now, Tanya has a PhD in sociology with special interest in narrative life fiction, social history and biography. As I said, she's mentioned in Sydney where she works as a research consultant amongst doing lots and lots of writing. She's quite prolific. Her first book, The Suitcase Baby, was longlisted for a David Awards, shortlisted for the Ned Kelly Award and the Danger Prize and the Mark and Yvette Moran Literary Award. Her second book, The Suicide Bride, that was published in 2019 and shortlisted for a Danger Prize. The Killing Streets, which was just published this year, is her third historical non-fiction true crime, and that was released by Hachette. And last, but certainly not least, we have Samantha Battams. And Samantha, if you can give us a wave. She's joining us based in Adelaide, and she's a global and public health academic, evaluation consultant in the health and community services sector, and a keen historian with numerous published academic articles and book chapters in the fields of public health and sociology. Her first true crime book, The Secret Art of Poisoning, The True Crimes of Martha Needle, the Richmond Poisoner, was published in 2019 and is longlisted for a Sisters in Crime David Awards this year. And Samantha is also a convener of the South Australian chapter of Sisters in Crime. So what's brought us all these authors together tonight is that all of the women featured in their books could be described as wayward, especially by the moral code of their particular era. Either intentionally or through force of circumstance, they transgressed society's rules in some way. Some prospered, at least for a short time, but generally they paid dearly for their actions. Now, I know our audience is dying to meet these fascinating women, and obviously the first thing we need to know from our authors is how they came across their subject material and what drew them to the stories in the first place. So I'm going to start with you, Samantha. With all the criminal figures in Adelaide you could have chosen, what made you focus on Martha Needle of Richmond, Melbourne?
Well, Martha Needle was actually from South Australia, like a lot of serial murderers are. I was actually going through some old newspapers because I'd written a family history, and my nephew asked if I would join him in helping him to write a book, which is another book I co-authored and published last year called The Red Devil, and it was about a pioneer aviator. And as I was researching this book, I found this article from Easter 1920, when the Smith brothers, who did the first UK to Australia crossing, arrived in Adelaide, and it was a huge event. But even bigger than that was a murder committed by a man and his 3 children at Easter. It was actually the Friday of Easter in 1920, and it was an absolutely huge case. And that sort of interested me, you know, what was this case bigger than the Smith brothers coming back to their home? And when I researched that, I found out the extraordinary link between Martha Needle. So that person who committed those murders was the nephew of Martha Needle, the Richmond Poisoner. And I thought, wow. And she committed a series of murders in her family. So I found a lot of information about Martha Needle, and previously the link between the nephew and auntie hadn't been made at that time. So I was really fascinated about how this could have, you know, happened in the same family, and the fact that Martha Needle was from South Australia originally, and I was interested in the circumstances around that, the historical and, you know, sociological circumstances around that.
Absolutely. And Tanya, I'll then pose the question to you as well. There's some pretty famous female criminal figures from Sydney, talking people like Tilly Devine and Kate Leigh, who I'm sure most people who've got even a passing interest in true crime will have heard of. Those guys actually did pretty well for themselves during the Depression. So what's important to you about telling the stories of less fortunate women like May Miller and Hilda White, and even Bessie OConnor in your latest book?
Yeah, that is actually precisely the reason that I write these books, because I'm a true crime reader, as we all are, and I was always fascinated with the stories of Tilly Devine and Kate Leigh. And I realised they weren't the normal archetype for the time. Every woman that's featured in the books that I write about, they really are much more representative. They tell a story about what life was really like for these women. And when you transgress social norms, and all of the women did in their own ways, they paid a very high price for that. So yeah, you've in fact tapped into the very reason why I write, because it tells that hidden history.
For sure. And Loretta, the thing I love most about Alice Anderson is that there's a little quote they've got in there that Alice just acted as though feminism had already happened. So she pretty much got about and did what she wanted. But I guess I do remember talking to you once, and you were saying that you were surprised that your book was picked up as a true crime book. But there is a murder, and there is a life tragically cut short in there. The other thing that I find criminal about the story is that Alice Anderson is not better known. So I wonder if you could tell us a story about how you came across her and how you decided to tell her story.
Well, exactly. She wasn't better known, and I first picked up on her in a book by Sarah Hardy, a Melbourne author who wrote a biography of Edna Walling, who was the famous Australian gardener. And she was Alice's contemporary. And so in one of the chapters of the book, Alice turns up in her huge Hupmobile to this party in Preston, of all places, which is just up the road from me, at this mansion of the Braithwaite sisters, and the father owned a tanning factory not far away. And it just talked about this woman that had set up this motor garage. She was the first woman in Australia to do so. And she had got herself into a lot of debt. She was this petite little woman. And I thought, why, not that I'm a redhead or anything, but why haven't I heard about her? And so when I started searching, there was a little bit about her, but no one had actually tackled the full story. So I thought, right, I'm it.
Excellent. That was an excellent project to take on, because she really was a fascinating woman. I guess you were lucky enough that you were actually able to meet some people who from her family and who got to know her. So you had some primary resources there. But I'm going to pose this to all of you, but I'll start with Loretta. But those primary resources are fantastic. But what other areas did you find research and get information about Alice and her gang of girls from?
I actually found quite a lot in her eldest sister's archives that were donated to the Melbourne University archives, and other researchers, because there was two other women, Mimi Colligan and Georgine Claassen, who had written about her, but not extensively, and they're both historians with PhDs in that area. And they had interviewed Frances Derham, Alice's oldest sister, and she'd given a few bits and pieces, but when she died, which is when I came along, there were all sorts of papers. There were about 100 boxes that weren't really properly catalogued. There were just descriptors on the boxes. So I spent a lot of time in the archives just going through, and I found original letters that Alice had written to friends and family, photographs, all sorts of things that no one else had picked up on. So that was a fabulous resource. And also everything else that our other authors would have looked through as well, you know, the Trove newspapers, which are fantastic, Public Records Office, Victoria, yeah, all the usual places. But meeting family members that obviously weren't alive when she was, because she died in 1926, were very supportive and helpful, and gave me a lot of information around the family in general that was very helpful in putting Alice's story together.
Wonderful. Now, Samantha, the same question for you, but also the fact that a man that Martha Needle was involved with, he actually started a very famous construction company, which is still going today. So did you come across any issues with talking about a family member who is quite prominent these days?
Not really. I did. So this Otto Juncken, he changed his surname from Juncken to Yuncken, and he founded Hanson and Juncken, and that built all of the major buildings in Victoria and South Australia and even Tasmania, and it's currently building the Royal Adelaide Hospital and all of the major modern buildings as well. I did contact them and ask them whether I could use a photograph that was on their website, and got permission for that.
Wonderful.
I had contact with one of his grandchildren, and I got permission to use Otto's letters that were in the State Library of Victoria, which was fantastic. And so people were actually really supportive. And in my launch in Adelaide, descendants of Otto Juncken were there, and descendants of the deceased parties were there as well, and Martha Needle's family members, descendants were there. So everybody was there. It was really interesting. I also went to the Public Records Office. I had to go to the old Melbourne jail and have a look at this display on Martha Needle as well, and spend time in the library reading those old letters and the court documents as well. And some of the family members had actually done, you know, had court documents that they gave me, and they were actually really supportive of the tale being told. So I didn't have any problems with that, although it was interesting, some of the banter between Otto Juncken's descendants and Martha Needle's descendants.
You didn't have to break up any fights or anything, did you, at the book launch?
No, but that was interesting, you know, how long that, you know, that sort of mentioning, oh, well, I'm a, you know, descendant of, you know, Martha Needle's sister, and oh, well, you know, oh, well, you know, there still was a strange feeling apparently between some people there. So that was really interesting. But I didn't have issues, but since then I've decided to do the follow-up story about the nephew, and I'm more than halfway through that. And I do have some concerns about some of the people being alive still and getting permission. So I need to, you know, work with some of the family members there on that too.
For sure.
Yeah.
Now, Tanya, as we mentioned earlier, you are quite a prolific writer. So I would imagine that from your research that you're perhaps more efficient, I would hope, in doing your research. But and there's just an incredible amount of detail in your books about people who've led quite ordinary lives. So it's not like they're on the front pages of newspapers or anything like that. So what sort of resources were you able to come across to find out about these women?
Yeah, look, I've now developed a bit of a methodology, I guess, is the way to describe it, is that I do a lot of genealogical research. So that's supplemented with secondary research. So it's the way I write it, like I'm not a historian, so it's a sociologist writing history. So I read a lot of social history, and that's what helps provide the context for the characters that I write about. But I also spend a lot of time at the archives. When I come across a story that looks of interest, I normally have to find some kind of jackpot resource. So it might be, it's not always criminal court transcripts, but it often is, because true crime, I think, we don't have the benefit when you write in this space. You don't always have the benefit of that heirloom history. So it's wonderful to hear Samantha and Loretta talking about having access to letters and things. The women that I've written about so far, I sort of haven't had access to that kind of stuff. So I normally spend a lot of time at the archives, find a jackpot resource, and that might even be an inquest. The inquest transcripts that are held by the archives in the state archive holdings are incredibly rich documents. But I've even used things like probate.
Interesting. Yep.
Incredibly detailed inventories of people's lives, and you get all the family connections as well. So yeah, my books are sort of a composite. They sort of triangulate lots of different resources to build the story.
For sure. And the thing that for me personally as a reader that I love about all of your books is they're not just dry notations of court documents or interviews and that sort of thing. All of you have managed to just weave these beautiful stories, and they read like a crime fiction novel. There's suspense, there's the intrigue, there's the just the interactions between the people on the page are just incredible. So I'm interested as to how you all find that fine line between writing something that's intriguing and interesting and sometimes titillating, balancing that against respect for these women who may not have had the most fortunate of lives. So I'll throw that to you first, Loretta, to run through that one.
Well, I guess in comparison to the characters that Tanya and Samantha write about, Alice had more of a fortunate life in that she was, even though there was relative poverty in the family at various stages, she was, of the upper class, which is why she kind of connected with the Edna Wallings and those people, and anyone that knew anybody of a certain, they were Irish Protestants, and they knew people of that upper echelon, so that made them a little bit different. But I suppose when I came to this, I love biography, I love true crime, and I'd read a lot of biography, and I thought, I don't want to make this dull. And so, because I have read some biographies that have been, interesting but fairly dull, because they draw together all the facts, and you can do that. But I think, as both Tanya and Samantha have done, is to put in that historical context, put in the sociological context, and to create a narrative glue that pulls it all together. And that's where and also when I looked at Alice's story, it had this incredible narrative arc as well. So it made for, even though it was non-fiction, I just thought, this is a great story. It was easy for me to plot out. It was filling out the detail and deciding the things that were the most interesting, I suppose, because we can't put everything we discovered in a book. So
No, they would be.
I've got a theatre background, so I studied film criticism and things like that. So I've always been very aware of the dramatic points, I suppose, and placing them in a way that makes a bit of a page turner.
Mm. And then again, as we mentioned, Tanya, some of the women that are featured in your books didn't have the greatest lives. And how do you sort of approach that, trying to be empathetic, but yet getting the stories out there, because they are really important stories to tell?
Look, I always try to look for ways that we can move past the tropes that surround women. The latest book, The Killing Streets, is an example of this, is that there's lots of stories that have focused on women sex workers, and they're situated in a particular context. So for those people that haven't read the book, there's a lot in the book about the history of the car and the connection to the movement of the car across the city, and the way that that became quite a physical, literal vehicle for undertaking sex work. And that's been written lots of times in books and in movies, that there's always the car that cruises past, the prostitute jumps in, and I use the word prostitute in historical context. It jumps in, and that's where the story begins. And so when I write about these women, I'm very conscious of the fact, how can we situate these women differently and in a very real way? So the book doesn't start in that way, even though that is in fact a pivotal part of the story. A woman does jump into a car and then is killed. The story starts with our main character in a kitchen cooking dinner for a partner, because we know that she did that, because we know what was in the contents of her stomach when she died.
Oh, I did wonder how you'd have that information. Okay, now I know, thank you.
And they actually could determine that at post-mortem, just in the same way that they do now. So they knew what her last meal was, and roughly the time that she'd eaten it. So it was really important for me to not situate the story in that really sort of cliched way, but to position it from the get-go. We start in a really different place, and we understand that woman differently.
Yes.
And in a very personal way.
Yeah. I really liked how you did that. Sorry, Samantha, were you going to jump in there? Or?
Well, I thought that rounding out who Martha was and telling her backstory and setting it in the context was really, really important, because there had been so much sensationalising of her story, both in the contemporary environment and also up to pretty recently, about, this notorious, charming serial murderer. But when I actually had a look at her horrific background and a number of other factors, and, 2 of her children basically starved to death from conditions that were related to, the Great Depression and poverty. But she was kind of made fun of. There was an effigy of her in the waxworks in Melbourne, in a Chamber of Horrors.
Yes.
And some of the lines in the newspaper, I've got one of them here. It said, in the Melbourne jail recently, Mrs. Martha Needle, pressed by circumstances and accord, retired from active life, leaving a void in the toxicological business, which it would be difficult to fill. Which is quite funny and witty from the journalist, but, there was this dehumanising that was going on. So I was really keen to round her out and tell, who she was beyond, the mental health issues, drug and alcohol and whatever, and tell a bit about her background.
Yeah, she certainly had a tough start to life, and that journey led her to where she was. But I am curious though, because I'm pretty sure I speak for a lot of people who may be in the audience, but I think we may have all wanted to poison someone in our lives at some point. So because we're looking at historical crime, are we so far removed from it in time that we can look back and sort of think, this is how you would do it, and you're sort of living a little bit vicariously through a woman like that? Is that something that's crossed your mind, Samantha?
Well, I've heard of people sitting in a cafe up at north of Adelaide talking about the book, and yeah, discussions about, you know, who would you do it, you know, how would you do it, and who would you do it, and, you know, things like that, sort of joking. But this, a similar murder happened in South Australia, and there were similar circumstances where a woman was accused of killing a number of people by arsenic. Very famous case, the Emily Perry case. So yeah, it's, you know, I was really interested, and I, you know, plan to do something with someone who's writing a book about Emily Perry as well, and contrast the two stories. But yeah, I do think there may be that there are sometimes those intentions, but yeah, it's interesting. There does seem to be a strong fascination with a poisoner.
Yes, and by the way, audiences, it's not an instruction manual, the book that Samantha's written, just so you know. We've talked a little bit about the circumstances that led these women to where they got to in life, and where you've covered them in the book. So, Tanya, I'm really interested in the differences between Hilda and May, and how they were treated versus Bessie when she entered the lexicon in Sydney, because they're all women who were in similar circumstances, but they were viewed very, very differently by both the police and the press. So if you could just walk us through how those two different kinds of women got to where they were.
There were, the book features, or it focuses on about 20 years of Sydney's history. And there was a period of very similar murders that happened over quite a prolonged period. But there were 3 murders that happened in 1932. In virtually 2 of them happened in the same green space. So one woman was killed on one corner of a park, another woman was killed on another corner of the park. Spaced out, 3 in the space of 1932, one sort of in the middle, and 2 in sort of December. They were all engaged actively in sex work. And the first 2 murders, there was a brief investigation of what happened, but really the police were very dismissive. The women were engaged in sex work. There was a lot of moral judgment of them putting themselves in a situation where really they were asking for it. The 3rd murder that happened that year was Bessie OConnor, and her murder happened in December, and it was really a turning point. She was 16. She was a daughter of a very proud Redfern family, working Redfern family. And although she was engaged in sex work, so I'm sure the same judgment would have been brought to bear on her, that was never really allowed to happen, because the Redfern community kind of stood up and started really stomping their feet. And the media got hold of the story as well. And it being a local family that a lot of people knew, it was a swimming champion kind of swimming family. She had a very famous brother that was a diver in Sydney, high diver. And as soon as the media got hold of Bessie's story, they were able to construct a more palatable narrative for the public. And it was really Bessie's story that I think mobilised the police, and they had to do something.
Yeah, so it's interesting how Bessie became the impetus for them to actually start investigating those murders properly. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And they all happened in a very short period of time, all 3 very, very similar. And we see it today, really, don't we? That the media, a certain narrative builds around a crime, and momentum falls away.
Unfortunately, yes. Now, Loretta, Alice was very, very different to the women covered in Tanya and Samantha's books. I guess she was fortunate that she did grow up in a time where women could be quite radical. They could start to cut their hair short. They were wearing trousers, shock horror, and sort of going outside of those social norms. But the way Alice grew up, actually, I think gave her a bit more of an advantage to turn into the adventuress that she became. So could you walk us through a little bit of how she actually managed to become such an incredible woman with so many skills that would normally be attributed to men, such as shooting and fixing serious wounds?
Well, she came from a very eccentric family, and her father was an engineer. And so she was born in 1897, which was really the year that the motor car came onto the scene. And so from a very early age, she would have seen motor cars in Australia. And she was probably one of the most intelligent in the family. And she had a personality that I would love to have met her. People that say that even if they'd met her for just 10 minutes, she was unforgettable. So she had this incredible charm and this incredible confidence from a very young age. She decided that the family needed a cow, for example, to get milk, and they were fairly poor at this stage. So she decided to, and because they were generally from upper class, the mother and father had never milked a cow in their lives. So she would just leave early to go to school, an extra 15 minutes, and go by a farmer's place where they had a cow, and she taught herself how to milk the cow, and then came back to the mother and said, "We need a cow." And the mother said, "Well, who's going to milk it?" She said, "I will." She said, "You don't know how to milk a cow?" And she said, "Yes, I do." So that's the sort of character that she was. And she just, it didn't matter what she came up against, she found a way around it. And I think compared to the women that Samantha and Tanya have written about, she had connections and she had charm, and I think that got her through. And she had that interest in mechanics from her father, and her father was a failed businessman several times over. He used to earn a lot of money, but he just whittled it away. He never knew how to manage money, and he had all these amazing ideas. He was a bit of a Walter Mitty character. She had her feet more planted on the ground, so she sort of took the enthusiasm from her father, but she had a certain pragmatism as well that I think meant that she was able to succeed. But I think it was her really coming into her own in the 1920s when she could actually get away with wearing trousers and having the short hair and being boyish. And she decided when she started her mechanic business that she'd only employ women, and that was a real risk. It could have gone either way for her, but the press saw it as kind of charming. But the other side of it was that a lot of the people, the women that she employed and her herself, were often seen as inverts. There was a lot of, gossip around various transgressions around lesbianism and things like that. So she fought against that. But she was very entrepreneurial, and she always had a good relationship with the press, and I think that really helped her get through.
Absolutely. I think I'll pick up on the lesbian point there as well, because that was something that probably wasn't talked about in proper society back then, but everyone seemed to have a spinster aunt or so on back then. So is that something that that Alice would have been quite open about, do you think, or was that something that she would have had to keep hidden?
Look, I was never able to prove either way whether she was a lesbian or not. She more than likely was, because I interviewed a lot of relatives of garage girls. "Oh, yes, auntie, great auntie so-and-so. We knew she had a relationship with so-and-so, and they lived together and they were into cars." And so I was able to prove certain relationships. And there was Jessie Macbeth, who ran a private hospital down in Glenferrie Road around the corner from Alice. They ended up meeting and becoming great friends. And Jessie was quite a bit older than Alice and was almost like this mother figure. But it was a known thing that she was in a relationship. She ran the private hospital, and her head nurse she had a relationship with. And they started a lot of the rumours around Alice, because sometimes she would go just to get a rest from the garage, and they would leave a spare room for her, spare bed for her, just so that she could sort of catch up on a bit of sleep, because she actually lived, once she'd built her garage, she had a little office, office and a bedroom off that office, and she lived there 24/7, which meant that she didn't have to pay rent or board anywhere. But it also meant that if someone rang at 3 a.m. and they needed to be towed, then she would get up and do that. She was young, she lived on 3 or 4 hours sleep a night, but every now and again she'd crash and she'd run around to Jessie Macbeth's and have a bit of a feed up and a bit of a rest.
Yes, yeah, being looked after by a mother figure, it's lovely. So we have come a long way with lesbian rights, still a long way to go, obviously. But Samantha, I wanted to ask you about the mental health issues, because it doesn't seem like we have come very far from when Martha was struggling with all of these issues to how we have now. There's still a lot of stigma attached to mental health. And I wondered what your thoughts were around how we can address that now and what we might have learned from Martha's time.
Well, I don't think there was a good understanding of mental health at all. And there seemed to be a lot of mental health issues feeding into her condition. For one, she was the victim of horrific abuse and neglect, and then it seemed to me that because of that she'd had dissociation and perhaps a personality disorder. She was also very, very charming, apparently. And then, you know, it seemed to be there were a whole range of things: post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and then there was evidence that even though we don't talk about catatonia now, that she was in catatonic states and had some psychoses, and you know, was hearing voices as well. So there were a whole range of things. You couldn't really pick one. And certainly if she was in a dissociative state, that was also promoted by the use of chlorodyne at the time, which could lead to psychosis. And I found an old BMJ article talking about the link between chlorodyne and that bringing up on psychosis and schizophrenia. So there were a whole range of things going on, and there was the Howard Society for Penal Reform that was trying to lobby, you know, the government at the time to quash her case because of, you know, mental health. But the Premier was new at the time and decided to uphold it. And because of all the media surrounding it, you know, it was a popular thing that she should be hung, which was very sad. But if you have a look at our prison systems at the moment, and I'm working on a public health and justice project at the moment, mental health rates of people in prison is still very high. You know, people with a pre-existing condition then getting in trouble because we don't have the treatment in the community, and the support in the community, housing linked to support, and homelessness ties into that as well. So, and then we've got first line practitioners without sometimes a good understanding of mental health and what the symptoms might be. So I think we really need good education of our police officers. Increasingly, security guards are being used in hospitals. They need to be educated because they're the ones on the mental health wards now.
Yes.
Security guards, you know, without, you know, strong training in understanding mental health, which is not very good. And we've moved away from the asylums, which to a less restrictive environment. But on the other hand, I do think we've forgotten some of that coordinated care for people with a serious mental illness and making sure that housing, we're spending so much more money on prisons, especially in Victoria, than we are on housing. So for me, it's all about the social determinants of health, good housing linked to support for people with chronic serious mental health conditions. And really it starts in childhood, the proper support and prevention for people, the parenting at home, the support at home, the nursing and other staff in the home, trying to prevent abuse and neglect in the first place. That's where it starts, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We've still got a long way to go in that space. And Tanya, I wanted to ask you, because there's not only in your last book with the focus on sex workers, but also with the Suitcase Baby and even the Suicide Bride, you're finding women in desperate situations who are just trying to fend for themselves and I guess live their lives. And you mentioned earlier on about the sex workers not being treated as respectfully as they probably should have been with perhaps the men who were working at the same time. And there's I think it's in one of your books that the men who were working on the Sydney Harbour Bridge at the time were putting themselves into incredible danger to make money for their families and survive. And yet the women who were putting themselves into incredible danger just to survive are not treated the same at all. So I wondered what your comments were around that, the way that men and women were treated differently just trying to get by at the time.
Well, it's interesting because that very year that much of the book focuses on 1932, and it was a really important year, was seen as being a pivotal year for the Depression, but it was also the year that the Harbour Bridge opened. And so I was doing a lot of reading around that. And the parallel to me, it's exactly what you were saying. I found that very poignant, that women that featured within the book, many of them were mothers. Their children had either been removed or they'd relinquished their children because of the shame of children being born out of wedlock. And so children were being raised in orphanages, but still being supported by the women who were engaged in sex work. And it was seen as being the more noble thing to do, to give the child an opportunity to live a life without the knowledge that there'd been this backdrop to their upbringing. So yeah, I found it a very poignant part of the book. But yeah, going back to it was something that we were talking about before that interested me in terms of the this being a solution for women. Crime was a solution for women. There was a criminal solution in each of the books that that I've written. It may not have been a morally a solution that we would approve of, but each of those women were seeking to solve a problem. And I don't know if Samantha and Loretta would, kind of...
Yeah. Can I just say, in the book, I do talk about Martha Needle's two youngest children having conditions, and I mentioned it earlier, linked to poverty. One was basically she was starving, and the other one had orofacial lesions linked to poverty and poor hygiene. And it was a period of a depression in Australia, which was worse than the Great Depression. And you had another very famous case in 1894. At the time, you had the baby farmers, people, working class women looking after babies for very low money. And then some of them were actually doing away with these poor children. And then that year of these two famous cases, Frances Knorr and Martha Needle, you had the very first Victorian Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children established, the first non-denominational. You also had in South Australia the same year women getting suffrage, and the Munster petition in Victoria in 1891. So it seemed to be a time of real tension, a real turning point. Women sick of their lot as well. And there's that solution. And in Martha's case, it was probably her children were starving. There may have been something about Munchausen's disease, which I talk about, which is making her children sick through arsenic. But then when I reflected on it after, I thought they were starving, and that could have been a solution as well.
Yeah. It's unfortunate they had to come to those ultimate solutions, because that an end of life is not necessarily the best solution, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Now I'm going to throw to some audience questions now. So I've got one from Charlotte here, which I think Charlotte would speak for many of us here. I just wondered if you have any advice for aspiring crime writers. So I might start with you, Tanya, seeing as you're a prolific crime writer.
Right. I think is what I'm trying to think what would be a good piece of advice. Reading and writing it's what they always say. It's that, you have to read, you have to understand the genre, but it is true. reading is what leads to writing in the space, I think, if that's helpful.
That does make sense, and I have heard that advice a lot. And Loretta, would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's just, you know, if you're looking at true crime, finding a story that really captures your imagination and chasing it down. And that might be looking at old newspaper articles, or, you know, whether it's in the past or in the present, to really just track something down and to see if anyone else has written about this fascinating thing, because there's plenty of fascinating stories out there.
Sure are. And Samantha, I know you write a lot of short articles for publication as well. So would you give some advice around perhaps starting with shorter stories? Would that be something you might advise people? Or?
Yeah, so of the stories I've got on my website, a lot of them are about interesting characters that I've found in my own family.
Do they know that?
There was, you know, the first winemaker in the Barossa Valley, and then I found out another pioneer. He ended up in Adelaide's asylum for 34 years. So I've got the stories of the amazing successful pioneers, and I've also got these stories about, you know, a labourer who come here, made it big, had all of the, you know, so much land, and then, you know, but had come from a pauper parent background and then ended up in the asylum in Adelaide, you know. So I found them in my family. So there's interesting stories on Trove. You might find some interesting hidden stories in your family. And people have been telling me stories since I've published the books, particularly police officers interested in crime, who are interested in history as well, saying, hey, what about this story? And that's been fabulous, you know, lots of suggestions there too. I just want to let you know I accidentally answered a question earlier, which
I saw you were extremely efficient with that, but that was awesome. So that was one around. Because you've already answered that, Samantha, we'll throw it to the other two. It's from Shannon, and they're asking, what point of view did you choose for your novel, and why did you choose this particular perspective to express your story? So I'll start with you, Loretta. So how did you choose the perspective there?
Oh, well, I again, I went back to the social context, I suppose, of it, but I definitely looked at the story in terms of a narrative arc and saw that there were natural dramatic points to pick out through the story, from her very beginnings and the up and downs with the family, and going from riches to rags to riches to rags, and dealing with the war. And I put a lot in about the Spanish flu, which is very interesting in the situation today. So there was all that background that really, you know, anything that linked with Alice and her garage girls, I put in there to really highlight, you know, the lives that they led and the history that they were living through, which is always relevant to the present in some form or other.
Awesome. Now I'm going to address this next question for you, Tanya. It's from Lillian. Now, you might have to delve back into the deep, dark depths of your memory to be able to answer this one, because she's asked, do you have an advice on where to begin historical research? And you've been doing it for quite some time now.
Look, there's all different sources for it. So the first book that I wrote, that actually the genesis of that came from researching the history of child protection in New South Wales. So I was doing a lot of work in community services at the time, and I wanted to know about the history of adoption legislation. And that was really, I came across a story about Sarah Boyd, and about she'd murdered her child and thrown the baby into Sydney Harbour. So part of it can even come, depending on what field you work in, you can really find crime stories anywhere. And some of them, I think I've made a conscious decision to write in a space. So The Killing Streets was really written because I wanted to write something around lust murders or sex murders, effectively. But yeah, you can really find them anywhere. And the archives, I would recommend that anyone go to the archives of your local state. They are places of wonder.
And also recommend setting aside a great deal of time to go down rabbit holes when you do that, yes.
That is true. That is true. And you have to be very patient, because it's not like a library where you can wander in and pick up a book off a shelf. But a lot has been done in the last couple of years to improve the accessibility in terms of searching. So a lot of the catalogues now for the state library, certainly within New South Wales, to use it as an example, you can even name search. So if you've got a relative that you might have an interest in, they've actually improved the indexing around a lot of those things. So you can even name search for people, because
That's wonderful for you, Samantha.
They really are wonderful, and it's all public record. So, you know, there's no, but other than years, some of the more recent stuff you can't see, but it's all there. It's all part of our history.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
sorry, go on, Samantha.
I was just going to say the second part of that question on the mental health resources. The British colonists were very good record keepers, and the Adelaide Asylum, the Glenside Asylum, had amazing records that I had a look at when I did my PhD in the State Library, the Adelaide University Library. There's also the genealogy societies, and the South Australian one had all of the old hospital records on a card, so you had to actually go and read those. And the old asylum here has an historical group, which I contacted recently, and that someone there gave me all the information about one of my ancestors too. So there are some other sources there for the mental health stuff.
Fantastic. Now, leading on from that, a question from Ian, which I'm sure we're all intrigued to know, because we all know there's a huge amount of information available to true crime researchers. Once you've selected your theme or protagonist, how do you keep track of all of your references and sources and so on?
Well, I can tell you what, as an academic, I wished to God I'd used my academic referencing on my books, because in the end I was madly going through, I'd kept a lot of them in an electronic file, but sometimes I had more details than others, and I thought, oh, if only I'd used EndNote, or Mendeley's a free version of EndNote that anyone can use. But I was a little bit more disorganised when I did my first book than I am as an academic, where I have to systematically record everything. So my recommendation to anyone is make sure you keep good resources from the start. And whenever I went into like the Public Records Office for book research or family history research, I always keep a little book that I have just for one project, or if I need more than one book for one project, I use that, and I always was able to refer back to those, even if it was scribbly notes. They were just that was really useful to have.
Wonderful. And Loretta, I'm curious, because you had so many different sources, you had in-person interviews as well as all the wealth of written material. How do you keep all of that together?
Well, I kind of learnt the hard way a little bit too, because I haven't done a PhD, and I didn't quite know what I was doing at the beginning, but I just kept everything digitally. I played around with EndNote, and I found that quite frustrating, I must admit. So I just decided on the sort of style that I was going to use in terms of the references that I was posing, and I just kept paper files as well, and I made sure that they were, you know, in some sort of order that I could go back to. And probably like a lot of people do if they're starting out, I probably over-researched, but, you know, that's not a bad thing. But I guess, you know, if I get to do as many books as Tanya does, I'll probably fine-tune that a little bit. I know the next book, if I go down, I'm writing a memoir at the moment, so that's a very different process. But, you know, I would like to go back to writing historical non-fiction. So yeah, I think the next time I'll do it a lot easier. I'll know how to streamline things. And as the years have come along, there's different, various different programs and things that writers can use too that, you know, I haven't really looked into. I basically just used the old Word document and yeah, just kept everything in a way that I could refer back to.
Perfect. And Tanya, have you refined your process over the years? Because I can imagine if you're trying to keep everything in one filing cabinet, you would need to rent another house by now.
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that everything really now, most things, because the archives now, when you're out there, you're basically taking photographs of everything that you've got out there. You really don't, well, I don't walk out with paper copies of anything at all anymore. And that has made a huge difference. So yeah, I've got massive digital archives effectively at home. And really for each of the books, it's little more than a box of paper, which is hard to believe. If I'd written these books 30 years ago, that would not have been the case.
Definitely not.
But yeah, no, very little paper, it's all digital.
Excellent. I've got a couple of questions. Both Gillian and Anne have asked variations of the same question: what's next off the press? And curious to hear what the writing projects the authors are working on currently. I think we've covered that for everybody mostly. Loretta, you're doing a memoir. Tanya, you're doing a book on
Sydney, yes,
and Samantha, you're doing the book on Martha's nephew.
Yeah, the Riney poisoning case.
Yes, yeah. So was there any other works that you wanted to let people know about?
I'm working on this biography of my great-great-great-grandfather, who was the first pioneer winemaker, the first commercial winemaker in the Barossa Valley, and with a Bavarian background, whereas most of the Germans who settled here had a Prussian background. So his is an interesting tale, which I've written a short story on my website about, and also about the Riney poisoning case, which is on my website too, if anyone's interested.
Fantastic. So I have a couple of questions to end on. What's the strangest thing you've ever had to recommend? If someone had a look at your internet browser history, what would people be a little bit perhaps shocked at? Tanya, you laughed at that one, so I'm going to get you to answer that one first.
I have thought about that many times. I'm sure anyone who writes in this space would think I don't know that I can openly admit to it, but for the first book in particular, there was a lot on how long it took to kill a child. And it's a terrible thing to admit, but the first book focused a lot on the process of smothering a baby. So there was a lot of research on that.
Yes. Loretta?
A lot of research on gunshot wounds and angles and things like that, because obviously in the 1920s there was nothing like the forensics that we have now. So trying to match what I know in the present time and looking back to the inquest documents and things like that, I'd have to go into all that detail. And I actually had to do quite a bit of research around the type of guns and what they do and how they do their work.
So the lesson here is people don't mess with Loretta. And Samantha, what's the strangest thing on your internet browser history?
Well, I was looking at how much arsenic it took to kill in an acute case versus chronic arsenic poisoning. And that probably raised some eyebrows from any of the, Four Eyes or whatever.
Again, people, that's a lesson in here, don't mess with Samantha either. So that brings us to the end of this discussion. Thank you, Loretta, Samantha and Tanya. I've had a fantastic time. I hope you have too, and I do hope the audience has enjoyed it. So the Geelong Regional Libraries, they're thrilled to let you know the libraries have now reopened. However, understandably, they are operating with reduced opening hours. So do check the website for any of the details for your local branch. Do also check out the library's Facebook page for more upcoming events, including Thomas Mayer, who will be discussing his amazing journey with the Uluru Statement from the Heart next Wednesday night. And you can also find more criminally good events brought to you by Sisters in Crime, including regular author panels and Murder Monday author interrogations. So far, we've had writers such as Val McDermott, Jane Harper and Kathy Rikes on our YouTube channel. And for more information, please do check our website, which is sistersincrime.org.au. So on behalf of Geelong Regional Library Corporation and Sisters in Crime Australia, I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. Please do stay safe everyone, and good night.
Good night.
Good night.